Hey friends, tonight we're going somewhere quiet, peaceful, picturesque, even at first glance. Imagine a little medieval village, chickens wandering freely, smoke curling from thatched roofs, and a farmer yawning at dawn. Sounds cozy, right? But what if I told you this wasn't the fairy tale version? What if I said you'd be waking up on a straw mattress beside a snoring cousin, with no plumbing, no privacy, and breakfast that might chip your tooth? Welcome to the real medieval countryside, where the only thing colder than the air is the soup. So before we start this lovely descent into mud, frostbite, and religious guilt, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far this strange little history club reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket that isn't full of fleas. And let's gently slip into a time where you definitely wouldn't last a day. You don't wake up. You're awakened by a rooster that doesn't understand time zones, by your father's coughing fit from the corner, by the draft seeping through the wall like it owns the place. The concept of sleeping in doesn't exist here. It's not even morning yet. Technically, the sky is still somewhere between black and regret. Your bed is not a bed. It's a pile of straw on the floor, shared with at least one sibling, possibly a chicken, and something that might be a rat, but you've chosen to believe is just a very assertive clump of hay. The blanket is thin, scratchy, and smells like wet sheep, probably because it used to be one. Your body aches before you've even moved. That's the effect of sleeping on straw and prayer. You stretch, carefully, because any sudden movement might wake up your younger brother, who will immediately steal your socks. He does this often. No one knows why. There's no window in your home. Not really. Just a hole in the wall, covered by fabric and hope. You gauge the time by the cold. If your breath fogs and your fingers burn, it's time to rise. The room is one room for everything. You sleep here, eat here, work here, give birth here, if it comes to that. Privacy is a theory from the future. You sit up slowly. The floor creaks, not because it's old, but because it's damp and wooden and resentful. Your mother is already up, stoking a fire that doesn't want to start. She doesn't speak, not because she's angry, but because talking before sunrise is a luxury, and words are fuel she can't waste yet. There's no bathroom, not indoors. If you're lucky, there's a bucket in the corner. If you're unlucky, that bucket is full. The smell of the morning is layered. A little bit of smoke, a hint of last night's soup, wet wool, and the unique aroma of several people who haven't bathed since the last festival. You breathe through your mouth. Everyone does. You pull on yesterday's clothes. They're also the week before's clothes. You own one set, maybe two if you're a baron of laundry. The fabric is rough, scratchy, and doesn't quite fit. It was likely passed down through 3 cousins and a goat. You tie it at the waist with a bit of rope. Shoes? Optional. Holes? Mandatory. You step outside. It's still dark, still cold, still deeply uninviting. The mud greets you first, then the frost, then the sound of someone shouting at a pig. The village is stirring. Fires are being coaxed, animals are being fed, and somewhere, someone is already complaining about the weather. You are awake. Not rested, not refreshed. Just awake. And that's how every day begins. Not with a sunrise, but with obligation. Let's talk about your house. You know, the charming little cottage nestled in a meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and warm sunshine? Yeah, no. Your home is a single-room hut made of wattle and daub. That's sticks, mud, and sheer optimism. The roof is thatch, which sounds quaint until it leaks, which it does, frequently, especially when it's not raining. Water just happens. It seeps in like it was invited. The walls breathe. Not in a poetic way. They literally let in wind, dust, insects. And on bold days, the neighbor's cat. There's no insulation. There's barely structure. If you push too hard on one side of the house, the other side creaks in protest. Your floor? Dirt. Not wood. Not stone. Just dirt. With patches of straw. If someone was feeling fancy, It's always damp, always. You've stopped asking why. You just live with it, and occasionally in it, depending on how deep the mud gets. There's one door, made from wood, that used to be part of a better house. It doesn't close completely. That's okay though. Privacy is more of a suggestion here than a feature. Same with security. Your lock is a rock. Inside, space is everything and nothing. The fire pit sits in the middle, slightly off-center, like a shy sun. It smokes more than it heats, and when the wind changes, it politely fills the room with tears. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof, and a prayer the wind doesn't blow south today. Your furniture includes a table that limps on one leg, 2 stools of uncertain stability, and a bench where Grandma once sat and hasn't stood up since. Beds are straw piles. The good one is near the fire. Guess who gets that? Not you. Storage is clever. Because it has to be. Things hang from beams, sit in baskets, or live under the bed alongside the family chicken. If it fits, it stays. If it smells, well, that's just life now. In winter, you block the cracks in the walls with cloth scraps and hay. In summer, you remove them and swat flies instead. There's no such thing as comfortable. There's just less cold and not currently on fire. Animals sometimes come inside. Pigs, chickens, goats. It's not a farm visit, it's a living arrangement. You share air, floor, and sometimes bed space. You learn to sleep through clucking. At night, everything creaks. The wind howls through holes you didn't know existed. Rats whisper across the rafters. The thatch rustles with secrets. You pull your thin blanket over your ears and pretend it's normal, because it is. This isn't a fairy tale cottage. There are no flower boxes, no lace curtains, no enchanted teapots. Just mud, straw, smoke, and you, hoping the roof holds through the night. It's not cozy, it's not romantic, but somehow, it's still home. It's morning. Officially, this time. The fire is finally cooperating, barely. Your mother moves like someone who's done this 1,000 times and never enjoyed it once. Breakfast is being made. You can smell it, unfortunately. There is no scent of bacon sizzling, no warm bread, no coffee. Forget orange juice, you've never seen an orange in your life. What's on the menu is the same thing that's always on the menu: gruel. Gruel is not soup. Soup has flavor. Gruel is hot water with ambition. It's a sad little mixture of oats, barley, or whatever grain didn't go moldy this week. It's boiled until it's vaguely thick, then ladled into wooden bowls that still smell like last night's stew. It has no salt, no sugar, no joy. You eat it slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because you're trying to chew the lumps without cracking a tooth. Sometimes it's thin, sometimes it's thick. Sometimes it's grey. But always, it's depressing. If you're lucky, there's bread. It's not fresh. It's not soft. It's a hardened loaf that doubles as a defensive weapon. You hold it in both hands and use your molars like a chisel. It takes effort. Effort burns calories, calories you barely have. You eat standing up, hunched by the fire. There's no dining table, no plates, no conversation, just chewing, slurping, and the occasional grunt from someone trying to swallow quietly. The younger children cry. Not because of the taste, but because there's not enough. There's never enough. You hand them a spoonful from your own bowl. You're still hungry, but that's normal. Hunger is background noise here. There is no butter, no jam, no milk, unless the cow hasn't dried up, or the neighbor hasn't borrowed your portion again. And even then, the milk is warm, slightly sour, and might contain straw. Tea? Only if you mean hot water poured over leaves someone found near the road. Real tea is for nobles. You drink boiled water because it's safer than the well. Probably. Sometimes someone mentions eggs. You laugh. You haven't had an egg in weeks. The chicken sleeps inside, but she's unionized. 1 egg a month, if she's in the mood. So you chew your bread. You sip your gruel. You try not to look sad. That would waste energy. This isn't a meal. It's a survival ritual. A ceremony to prove you're still here, still upright, still able to swing a hoe in the fields without collapsing. Breakfast is not a comfort. It's a requirement. And once you're done scraping the last cold spoonful from the side of your bowl, you wipe your mouth with your sleeve, the same sleeve you used to feed the pigs, and head outside. The ground is still muddy. The air still smells like ash. But you've eaten. Barely. And now, it's time to work. Getting dressed in the medieval countryside is refreshingly simple, because you have nothing to choose from. No closet, no drawers, no morning dilemma about whether to wear the brown tunic or the slightly browner tunic. You own one outfit, maybe two if someone in your family died recently and you got their clothes in the inheritance. A shirt, a pair of trousers, a woolen overcoat if you're lucky, and a string. The string is important. It holds your dignity together. Your shirt is made of linen, which sounds soft until you realize it's not the linen of fancy hotels. This one's scratchy, loosely woven, and smells permanently of goat. You've worn it for so long, it stopped being fabric and started becoming a second skin, itchy, stiff, and always slightly damp. Over that, a tunic. Probably wool. Not the warm kind, just the heavy, itchy kind that traps both heat and regrets. It was originally grey, but now it's mostly brownish, thanks to a lifetime of mud, smoke, and things you've stopped trying to identify. Your trousers, if you have them, are baggy, patched, and threadbare in all the wrong places. They're held up by whatever string, rope, or miracle you have on hand. Sometimes it's literally a hand, because if you let go, they fall. Underwear, number, just, no. Socks, if you have them, they're mismatched and riddled with holes. One is probably made from someone's old sleeve. You're not even sure it started life as a sock. Shoes are optional. Mostly because they're expensive. Not because you're free-spirited. If you own a pair, they're made of leather so stiff it could double as armor. If you don't, you wrap your feet in cloth and hope for the best. Either way, your toes are cold, wet, and deeply resentful. Washing clothes is a biannual event. You wash them when they're so stiff they stand up on their own, or when a priest says something about godly cleanliness. Otherwise, dirt is just part of the outfit. A pattern, a texture, a lifestyle. In summer, you sweat into your clothes. In winter, you freeze in them. There's no wardrobe rotation, just suffering in layers. If something rips, you sew it, badly. If it smells, you hang it in the smoke above the fire. If it catches fire, you slap it out and keep wearing it. There are no replacements. Clothes aren't fashion, they're survival. And you don't outgrow your clothes. You adapt to them. That shirt from age 7? Still wearable, just shorter now. Exposes the belly, adds ventilation. No one expects you to look nice, but you're expected to look decent. Decent here means covered, mostly. So when you step outside in your one and only outfit, scratchy, smelly, and slowly disintegrating, remember, it's not about looking good. It's about still having something to wear. And in this village, that's already impressive. Now that you've eaten, if we're calling that eating, and dressed, if wrapping yourself in wool and hope counts, it's time to work, because that's what life in the medieval countryside is, work. From sunrise to sunset. And then some. There are no weekends. No paid leave. No mental health days. You work when you're tired. You work when you're sick. You work when it rains. You even work when you dream. And often, your dreams involve more work. You head to the fields, usually by walking through another field. The earth is cold, damp, and stubborn. It doesn't care that you're 15, or 60, or missing a few fingers. It still needs plowing. If you're lucky, there's a plow. If you're really lucky, there's a plow and an ox. If not, then congratulations, you are the ox. Grab the handles, lower your back, and drag the blade through the soil until you forget what standing straight feels like. The soil is heavy, sticky when wet, cracked when dry. It clings to your boots, your hands, your soul. You dig, you rake, you weed, you sweat. And that's just the first hour. There's no machinery, no tractors humming in the background. Just you, a wooden hoe, and a constant, nagging voice in your head asking, is this worth it? Spoiler. It has to be. You don't have a choice. Your fingers blister. Your back aches. Your knees crunch when you stand. But you keep going. Because if the field doesn't yield, you don't eat. It's that simple. In the summer, the sun burns your neck until your skin peels. In the winter, the frost bites through your shoes and numbs your toes into silence. You learn to swing a sickle with stiff fingers. You learn not to cry when the wind cuts through your only shirt. Children work, elders work, pregnant women work. The baby might be strapped to her back, or crawling behind her in the mud, chewing on a beetroot and learning early what life's about. There are brief breaks, a gulp of water from a clay jug, a piece of bread with more crust than core, then back to bending, lifting, sweating, repeating. Your tools break? Fix them with string and patience. Your hands crack? Rub in some lard. Your spirit breaks? Too bad. Keep going. You think about stopping, just lying down in the field and letting the clouds pass. But then you remember the harvest is late, the cow's gone lame, and your neighbor borrowed your shovel and never gave it back. Again, you won't retire. You won't take a vacation. You'll work until your knees give out or your breath does. And even then, someone will probably ask you to just hold this basket while they keep digging. So you keep working. Not for riches, not for reward, but because the land doesn't care how tired you are, and neither does time. Take a deep breath. Go on. Inhale the fresh, crisp, clean country air. Ah, yes. There it is. A heady blend of damp earth, old smoke, manure, and just the faintest whiff of human exhaustion. This isn't the countryside you see in postcards. This is the real thing. And it has a smell. Several, actually. All competing for attention. First, there's the manure. It's everywhere. Cow dung, pig droppings, chicken, incidents. You step over it, around it, occasionally in it. You tell yourself you're building character. But your boots disagree. If you have boots. Then there's the smoke. It curls from every thatched roof, from every chimney, from every open fire where someone's trying to boil barley into something edible. The wood is damp, so it smoulders more than it burns. The smoke is thick, slow, and personal. It follows you, into your clothes, your lungs, your dreams. Sometimes it mixes with peat smoke, earthy, rich, and somehow wet. Or worse, dung smoke, because not everyone can afford firewood. You know that moment when the wind shifts, and suddenly it's all in your face. That's daily life here. Next comes the animals. The barn is right next to the house, or part of it, or under it, which means your mornings smell like hay, fur, and whatever your goat did during the night. You've grown to recognize which animal did what, based purely on scent. It's a talent, not one you wanted, but still. And let's not forget people, bathing is rare, soap is a luxury, scented oils are for bishops. So, your fellow villagers carry with them the unmistakable bouquet of hard labor, wet wool, and clothes that haven't seen water since the last funeral. You notice it most in church, or when someone raises their arm to wave, and the entire pew leans away. Every so often, there's something nicer. Fresh baked bread from the manor house, herbs drying on a windowsill, or flowers growing bravely in a ditch. These moments are fleeting, like hope on the wind, but you notice them. You have to. Because you live in this smell. You sleep in it, work in it, eat through it. It clings to you like history itself. You stop noticing after a while. But when someone from another village visits, they wrinkle their nose, and you know, this is your perfume now. The village smells alive, not clean, not sweet, but alive. It reminds you that things are growing, rotting, cooking, breathing, surviving. And weirdly, there's comfort in that. Because under all the soot, all the stink, all the damp wool and stubborn smoke, there's a heartbeat. And sometimes, just sometimes, it smells a little like hope. Privacy is a foreign concept in your medieval village. Not just rare, non-existent. You don't just live with your family. You live next to, around, and sometimes on top of everyone else in the village. Your home is 5 steps from your neighbor's door. The walls are thin, the windows are open, and gossip travels faster than fire. When you sneeze, 3 households bless you. When you fight with your brother, someone 2 houses away offers unsolicited advice. And when you sneak out to relieve yourself behind the shed, someone sees. Someone always sees. The village is small. A few dozen families. Maybe 100 people at most. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's business, habits, grandmother, and childhood mistakes. Especially the mistakes. There's no last name here. You're known by your role, your trade, or your latest scandal. Thomas the Thatcher. Agnes who fainted at the May Fair. Will whose goat ran through the church during Mass. And you? You might be the one who farts in his sleep because someone heard it once. And that's your legacy now. You can't keep secrets. Not because you talk too much, but because the walls do. The wind carries everything. The kids repeat what they hear. The old women remember everything. And if someone gets sick or pregnant or loses a chicken, the whole village knows before they do. The gossip network is robust, efficient, and entirely powered by boredom. Nothing happens here without becoming communal knowledge within the hour, sometimes within the minute. There's a strange safety in that. If your roof collapses, 5 men appear with hammers and rope. If your bread burns, someone shares theirs. If your child goes missing, half the village stops what they're doing and starts shouting their name. Not because they like you, but because you're part of them. Like a creaky floorboard, annoying, but still part of the house. Arguments happen. Constantly. Over goats, boundary stones, who stole whose spoon in 1327. People yell. They hold grudges. Then they go back to sharing a well and pretending nothing happened. Because they have to. You share work, pain, food, and air. There's no escape, no vacation, no city to run to. The next village is a day's walk away, and they probably already know your reputation. You're not anonymous. You're available. All the time. So yes, you are known. Deeply. Invasively. Lovingly. Frustratingly. Every mistake you make echoes through dinner tables you weren't even invited to. Every compliment gets misquoted 3 times before sunset. You are not an individual. You are a thread in the fabric. Scratchy, stubborn, and impossible to remove. And oddly enough, you'd miss it if it disappeared. After a full day of digging, sweating, carrying, bending, scraping, lifting, and pretending you're not completely broken, it's finally evening. You've survived the daylight. Now comes the fun part. Fun being a relative term. There's no tavern down the road. No Netflix. No radio. No cards. Unless someone drew them by hand and is willing to share. Your village doesn't have a theatre. It is the theatre, just made of dirt, smoke, and repressed emotions. So, how do people unwind? They gather. Around the hearth, around a bench, sometimes just in a vaguely circular formation near the door. Someone sits. Someone starts humming. Someone else mutters, "Not this one again," and so it begins. Folk songs, not the upbeat kind. These are slow, droning, slightly off-key tunes about harvests, heartbreak, haunted barns, and a man who went into the woods and never came back, again. You've heard them 1,000 times, so has everyone else. But you sing anyway, because what else are you going to do? There's something oddly comforting about it. The repetition. The sadness, the communal sighing. Sometimes someone has an instrument. A flute made from bone. A stringed thing, with only 2 strings left. A drum that's just a pot turned upside down. Music isn't polished. It's survival noise, meant to drown out the silence. And then there are stories, told by elders, exaggerated by everyone, remembered differently each time. Tales of witches, wolves, lost gold, saints, monsters, and that one time someone met a man with glowing eyes in the forest, who might have just had cataracts. Children love these stories. Adults pretend not to. You've heard them all before, but still lean in a little when someone says, "They say on nights like this." Because what else are you leaning into? The draft? If someone's really ambitious, there's dancing. Shoes thudding on packed dirt, hands clapping in uneven rhythm, laughter, gasping, swearing when someone steps on a toe. The dances don't have names, they're just movements. Movements that feel old and necessary, like brushing the smoke out of your face. And when all of that fades, the stories, the songs, the movement, people fall quiet. Not dramatically, just naturally. Eyes drift toward the sky. You can't see much, too many clouds, too much smoke, but still, you look and listen. To the wind, to the fire crackling, to the pigs settling in with a grunt. That's the end of the day. Not a grand finale. Just soft darkness and the feeling of bodies slowing down. You curl up on straw, or on your coat, or on someone else's coat if they're feeling generous. You listen to one last hum, one last cough, one last prayer, and then you sleep. Not because you're fully rested, but because the stars have come out, and in this village, that's the closest thing to a signal that says, you've made it through another day. In your medieval village, faith isn't a choice. It's the air you breathe. Thick, unquestioned, and always present, like smoke, but holier. Every day belongs to God. And every moment is lived under his watchful, silent, slightly judgmental eye. The church is the tallest building in the village, not because it's grand, but because everything else is short. It's made of stone, always cold, and smells of candles, damp stone, and generations of whispered confessions. It rings bells, loudly, often, to remind you, time isn't measured in hours here, it's measured in prayers. You go to church often, on Sundays, of course, and on feast days, and saint days, and the eve of saint days, and any day that vaguely sounds religious. The Lord has a packed calendar. Inside, the priest reads in Latin. You don't speak Latin. No one does. But you nod anyway, because it sounds serious. And because everyone else is nodding. You'd hate to stand out. You kneel on stone. You cross yourself. You whisper prayers you barely understand, but say them anyway, just in case. Because in this world, sin is real, so is hell. And you're poor, so you can't afford sin. Confession is encouraged. Public shame is common. Redemption is hard won and usually involves fasting, self-blame, or giving your last chicken to the church. You do it anyway. Because what if you don't? What if your bad harvest wasn't the weather, but your attitude? When things go wrong, and they do, constantly, the answer is always the same. It's God's will. Rain destroyed your crops? God's will. Wife sick? God's will. Fell into the latrine? Okay, that one's your fault, but still, probably deserved. You believe not because life is good, but because without faith, life wouldn't make any sense at all. Why else would you be cold, tired, hungry, and covered in pig dung unless some higher being had a reason for it? And sometimes, faith does comfort. The hymns are beautiful. The candles flicker like tiny promises. The stained glass, if your church can afford it, is like sunlight caught in a story. You believe in angels, in saints, in miracles. You also believe in curses, demons, and the angry ghost of that monk who drowned in the pond. It's a full spectrum. Your priest is part spiritual guide, part local judge, part therapist, and part informant to the landlord. Still, he blesses your fields. He prays for your sick child. And when someone dies, he reminds you that heaven is waiting and that it's better than here. By a lot. So yes, you're hungry. Yes, you're cold. But you're faithful. And that means something. Because in a world where you can't control the weather, the harvest, the rats, or the economy, sometimes the only power you have is to believe. And in this village, that's enough to keep going. In your medieval village, getting sick isn't surprising. It's expected. You're not healthy. You're simply not dying yet. Everyone is coughing. Everyone is tired. Pain is normal. Aches are just part of growing up, growing old, or growing anything at all. There are no doctors here. Not really. No one in a white coat. No clean tools. No knowledge based on science, just tradition, rumor, and very enthusiastic guesswork. If you fall ill, your first stop is likely your mother, or a neighbor with a jar of something green. Next, the village priest, who sprinkles holy water and mutters Latin. And finally, the local healer. A woman with dirt under her nails and 30 kinds of dried leaves hanging from the rafters. She'll boil something bitter, rub something oily, or bury a toad under your threshold, depending on how serious it is. Fever? Try willow bark. Or sit in cold water and pray. Toothache? Tie garlic around your neck and wait. Chest pain? That's either a blessing in disguise or a sign the devil has entered through your lungs. Either way, someone will light a candle. There are no pills, no antibiotics, no thermometers, no stethoscopes, no charts. Your symptoms are described in vague poetry. You look grey. He's burning up. She hasn't blinked in 3 days. Bloodletting is popular. If you're weak, they assume you have too much blood, so they drain it. You lie still as someone pokes your arm with a dull blade and collects your life in a bowl. Leeches are used when knives are too much trouble. They're kept in jars and treated like co-workers. If your leg is broken, you tie it to a stick. If it's infected, amputation. No anesthesia. Just a strong man, a wooden block, and a prayer that you'll pass out before the second cut. Hospitals do exist, in cities, run by monks. They are not places of healing. They are places you go to die quietly, indoors. Back in the village, you recover at home. Which is to say, you lie on straw, shivering, sweating, and hoping. Your family hovers. Someone boils water. Someone else cries. Sometimes, they sing. If you die, it's God's will. If you live, it's also God's will. Either way, the priest comes, says a few words, and blesses your forehead with holy water that's been reused more times than anyone wants to admit. Children die often. So do mothers. Sometimes even the strong, the ones you thought would last forever. It doesn't take much, a chill, a scratch, a cough that lingers too long. And yet, somehow, life goes on. People still fall in love. Still have children. Still share old cures and stories about Great Aunt Mary, who beat the fever with onion soup and stubbornness. Because in a world where medicine is mystery and sickness is daily background noise, the only real remedy is endurance. And maybe belief. So when your throat scratches, when your skin warms, when your breath feels tight, you lie back. Close your eyes. Drink something bitter. And hope the sun still rises with you tomorrow. In your medieval village, you don't eat because you want to. You eat because the sky allows it. There are no food deliveries, no marketplaces with overflowing produce, no magical pantry that restocks overnight. You grow what you eat. You eat what survives. And what survives depends entirely on the weather. Too much rain? Your fields turn to soup. Barley drowns. Onions rot in place. Potatoes vanish under puddles. You go out to harvest and sink ankle-deep in mud. You bring home a basket full of disappointment and snails. Too little rain. The ground cracks. The plants wither. The air dries your throat before you can curse the heavens. Wheat heads droop. Cabbages shrivel. The cow stares at the dirt like it's personally offended. Hail arrives with no warning. Just thunder, wind, and then chaos. Pebbles of ice, the size of your regrets, smashing every leaf, stem, and hope you had for the season. You run out to save what you can, and return with a handful of stems and a broken hoe. Frost, always early, or late, or both. It tiptoes in overnight, unseen but deadly. One morning, you wake to a thin white layer across your crops, beautiful, in the way that funeral flowers are beautiful. By the time the sun rises, the damage is done. Then there's the wind. It doesn't ask. It tears through your fields, topples haystacks, slams shutters, and unroofs your storage shed. You chase down a wheelbarrow. It outruns you. And snow. Looks lovely. Kills slowly. You wrap yourself in everything you own, step outside, and hope your breath doesn't freeze in your beard. But the worst part of weather isn't the storms or the cold. It's the waiting, the hoping, the helplessness. You plant in spring, eyes always skyward. You pray for sun, but not too much. You pray for rain, but not on market day. You pray for calm, but nothing ever stays still here. Because your entire year depends on a season you can't predict. And if nature doesn't cooperate, there's no backup plan. When the harvest is good, and sometimes it is. You celebrate. You gather. You share. You dry apples, salt meat, store turnips like treasure. When it's bad, and often it is, you ration. You water down soup. You grind acorns into bitter flour. You chew slowly, pretend to be full, and look away when the children ask for more. There are no food banks, no relief wagons, just neighbors sharing less and less until there's nothing left to share. You stop thinking in months. You think in harvests, in frost lines, in how much hay is left for the cow. And yet, every year, you plant again. You mend the fences. You patch the roof. You turn the soil like it didn't betray you last time. Because you have to believe. In sun, in rain, in the small mercy of a late frost. Because hope, in your village, grows like barley, slowly, carefully, and always with one eye on the sky. In your medieval village, the strongest person you'll meet probably isn't the blacksmith. It's the woman hauling water with one hand, stirring porridge with the other, and calming a crying child using only her voice. She doesn't rest. She doesn't ask for recognition. And she doesn't get any either. From the moment she wakes, earlier than everyone, her work begins. She stokes the fire, feeds the animals, pours yesterday's boiled water into today's wooden bowl. Then she starts breakfast, which means grinding grain by hand, kneading dough without yeast, and swatting away flies that think they have more rights than she does. Her children climb on her, cry at her, cling to her. Her husband needs his boots stitched. The neighbor borrowed her broom. The goat ate her laundry. The day hasn't even properly started. She doesn't get paid. She doesn't get weekends. She doesn't get personal space. She gets results and more work. In the fields, she labors beside the men, weeding, planting, harvesting. She carries baskets heavier than her youngest child, who she also carries, sometimes at the same time. Then back home, washing, spinning, mending, brewing, peeling, stirring, scraping, cleaning, always cleaning. Water doesn't come from a tap. She walks to the well. Again and again. Each trip is a journey of soaked shoes and sore shoulders. Her clothes are simple. Rough wool, faded linen, hands stained from herbs, smoke, blood, and soap that never fully lathers. She is expected to be modest, to speak softly, to listen to others, but not be heard too much herself, to serve meals and silence in equal measure. If she's unmarried, she's a servant. If she's married, she's still a servant, just under a different name. She births children without doctors. She nurses them through fevers with only broth and lullabies. Sometimes she buries them, and still she wakes up the next day to start again. She holds 1,000 roles: cook, midwife, tailor, healer, disciplinarian, peacemaker, storyteller, and occasionally her own person when no one's watching. If she breaks down, no one notices. If she disappears, everything falls apart. But if she does it all, quietly, consistently, with care, no one says a word. That's how she knows she's done well. In church, she sits in the back. In family records, her name might be wife of or mother to. In songs, she's a passing image, a figure in the background, stirring something. But her presence is everywhere. In the bread that feeds, in the shirts that warm, in the stories whispered at night to make children feel safe in a world that rarely is. And at the end of the day, she lies down not because she's finished, but because her body has decided she must. Tomorrow, she'll rise again, to do it all, without applause, without pause. Because in this village, women don't rest. They carry the world, and no one hears the sound it makes when they do. In your medieval village, no one asks what you want to be when you grow up. You're already doing it. The idea of childhood, of carefree days, games, learning, laughter, is a luxury no one here can afford. If you can walk, you can carry something. If you can talk, you can be sent on errands. And if you can hold a broom, a basket, or a bucket, congratulations, you're useful. You don't have toys. You have chores. Maybe a carved bit of wood, maybe a stone you named. But mostly, you play when adults are distracted. And even then, someone might call your name halfway through. By age 5, you fetch water. By 7, you gather firewood. By 10, your hands are rough, your knees always dirty, and you've already seen someone die. You're not coddled. You're expected. Expected to listen, to carry, to help, to stay out of the way, and also somehow be everywhere at once. If you're a boy, you learn your father's trade by watching, copying, and being scolded when it goes wrong. If you're a girl, you're already helping your mother, peeling, stirring, mending, calming younger siblings while she tends to everything else. You go to church, you sit still, you kneel when others kneel. You don't understand Latin, but you understand the tone. God is always watching, so is everyone else. School? Only if the priest has time. Only if your family doesn't need you to stay home. And even then, it's not arithmetic or literature. It's memorizing prayers and copying letters with fingers still swollen from chopping turnips. You laugh sometimes. Children always find ways. In puddles, in shadows, in whispered games behind the haystack. But your fun is brief, quiet, and always cut short. You learn not to cry in front of others, unless you're very small, or someone's very sick, or someone's just died, and even then, only a little. Sickness finds you early. A fever, a cough, a rash. No medicine, no doctor, just someone wiping your forehead and whispering that you'll be fine. Sometimes you are. Sometimes you're not. And still, you grow. Taller, quieter. You learn to braid rope, to carry fire without burning yourself, to lift just enough without tipping. You learn which berries to eat, which mushrooms to avoid, and how to spot a lie in an adult's face. By the time you're 12, you're working like a grown-up. By 14, maybe married. By 15, maybe a parent. There are no parties for your birthday. Sometimes, not even cake. Just a nod, maybe, a pat on the head, and more work to do. But even in all that, you still find moments. A song hummed while stirring soup, a race through the field at sunset, a secret promise to yourself that one day your children might rest more than you did. And so you carry on. Not because you're strong, but because you're expected to be. And in this village, expectations grow faster than children. So, after waking up on straw, choking on chimney smoke, working through hunger, frost, and the occasional goat-related injury, you made it. One full day in a medieval village. Barely. You didn't ride a horse. You didn't wield a sword. You didn't dance in castles or dine with kings. You carried water, dug dirt, and prayed it wouldn't rain. Or worse, that it would. Life here wasn't glamorous. It was quiet, hard, small, held together by calloused hands, whispered songs, and the kind of hope that doesn't ask for much. And yet, they endured. Not because they were heroic, but because they had no other choice. Because survival wasn't a story. It was just the next morning. So now, as you drift off, warm and full and safe in your modern bed, try to remember the world you came from, and the quiet strength of those who came before you. Good night, and sleep, finally, in peace. When we think of ancient women, we might imagine quiet figures in the background, tending fires, raising children, and speaking only when spoken to. But in the Celtic world, that image doesn't quite fit. Long before women were expected to be quiet or invisible, Celtic women were already owning land, managing households, and sometimes leading communities. They were not just decorative, they were powerful, and they didn't ask for permission. The Celts were a collection of tribal societies that spread across Europe during the Iron Age. Their world was wild, spiritual, and deeply tied to the natural landscape. Rivers were sacred, trees were wise, and women, well, they were surprisingly free. In some parts of Celtic society, women could inherit property from their parents, keep their own dowry, and pass land on to their daughters. They weren't simply the wives of men. They could be heads of households in their own right. A woman might own cattle. She might oversee the laborers who worked her fields. She might even take another person to court. This wasn't a society where women were treated as children. The law, at times, treated them as equals, or at least as individuals with agency. Of course, it varied from tribe to tribe, and from region to region. But the records we do have, mostly written down later by Roman or Christian writers, paint a picture of a world where a woman's place wasn't just in the home. It was also in the field, in the council, and occasionally on the battlefield. And it wasn't just legal status, it was cultural. In Celtic myths, goddesses weren't just mothers or lovers. They were warriors, queens, and creators of chaos. They ruled rivers and foretold death. They didn't always help you, they might even kill you, but they were respected, revered, feared. These were not gentle bedtime figures. They were powerful symbols of nature and fate, and in those myths, mortal women followed suit. The image of a Celtic woman wasn't delicate. She might wear heavy jewelry, carry a blade, and speak her mind. Some Roman writers, perhaps uncomfortable with the women they saw, described them as loud, opinionated, and physically strong. To Roman sensibilities, this was uncivilized. To the Celts, it was normal. A woman might be beautiful, yes, but she might also be dangerous. Still, life in the Celtic world wasn't easy. The environment was harsh. The winters were long. Survival wasn't guaranteed. So a woman wasn't judged just by her appearance or her virtue, but by her usefulness, her wisdom, and her resilience. A woman who could manage land, care for animals, and speak well in public wasn't just admired, she was essential. This might sound empowering, and in many ways, it was. But if you, a modern person, were suddenly dropped into that world, you might not last long. For one thing, personal hygiene wasn't exactly a high priority. Baths were rare. The air often smelled of smoke and sweat. Soap, if it existed, was rough and made of animal fat. And let's not forget the lice. Everyone had lice. Your clothing would be made of heavy wool, itchy, scratchy, and not exactly breathable. Your shoes would be stiff leather. There would be no coffee, no shampoo, no phone to scroll through while avoiding conversation. Instead, you might wake up at dawn, eat cold oats, and spend the morning hauling water or weaving cloth. By midday, your hands would be raw. By nightfall, you'd be exhausted. So yes, Celtic women had rights. But they also had responsibilities. And their freedom came with a price. Hard work, constant discomfort, and the ever-present possibility of war. Because if your tribe was attacked, you weren't just hiding in a hut. You might be grabbing a spear. Still, compared to many other ancient societies, the Celtic world offered women something rare: visibility. A woman's name might be remembered, her land might remain hers, her voice might matter. She might be respected not as a wife or a daughter, but simply as herself. That kind of freedom wasn't perfect, it wasn't always fair, but it was real, at least until the Romans arrived. But that, as they say, is another story. When we picture the past, we often imagine women staying behind, tending fires, raising children, and waiting for their husbands to return from battle. That was not always the case. At least, not for the Celtic world. For Celtic women, war was not a forbidden realm. It was simply another place where they could exist. There are stories, sometimes written by their enemies, that describe Celtic women riding into battle beside the men. They carried spears, they screamed war cries. They painted their bodies with blue dye and faced death with open eyes. To the Romans, who believed women should remain indoors, this was shocking. To the Celts, it was simply life. One Roman historian, Diodorus Siculus, wrote that Celtic women were nearly as tall as the men and equal to them in courage. That may sound flattering, but to Roman ears, it was closer to a warning. These were not passive women. These were women who might kill you in battle and loot your corpse afterward. Not very ladylike, at least by Roman standards. In Celtic stories and oral traditions, warrior women were not uncommon. There was Scathach, a legendary trainer of heroes, who lived in a fortress and taught young men how to fight. There was Queen Medb of Connacht, who led an entire army in search of a magical bull. These stories are part myth, part memory. But the consistency is interesting. Celtic women were not simply supporting characters, they were sometimes the generals. And then, of course, there was Boudica. Boudica is one of the most well-known Celtic women in history. She lived in what is now eastern England, around the 1st century CE, and she became a queen of the Iceni tribe after her husband's death. The Romans, who had claimed the land as their own, ignored her rights, assaulted her daughters, and took her property. In response, she did not write a letter. She did not complain to a magistrate. She raised an army. Boudica's rebellion was massive. She gathered tens of thousands of warriors, many of them women, and burned Roman towns to the ground. She led her people with fire, fury, and chariots. At one point, she nearly drove the Romans out of Britain entirely. Her revolt eventually failed, but her legend lived on. Even the Roman historians who hated her couldn't ignore her. They described her as tall, terrifying, and intelligent. She was, in many ways, their worst fear, a woman who didn't stay in her place. But Boudica wasn't an exception. She was the product of a culture that allowed women to fight, to lead, and to command loyalty. Celtic tribes were often built around strength, not gender. If you could ride, speak well, and strike fear into the hearts of your enemies, then you had value, regardless of whether you wore a beard. Still, life as a warrior woman was not glamorous. If you were hoping for clean armor and dramatic music, you'd be disappointed. Battlefields were muddy. Spears were heavy. Shields could break your arm. And you would be fighting in a wool dress, most likely with no proper shoes. Your meals? Cold meat. Your bed? The ground? Your shampoo? Non-existent. Also, the warriors did not get paid vacation. You might spend days walking in the rain, sleeping under trees, and waiting for a fight that might never come. And when it did come, there were no rules of engagement. It was loud, brutal, and over quickly. If you were lucky, you died fast. If not, you came back with broken ribs and a missing tooth, if you came back at all. So, while Celtic women had the right to fight, it wasn't necessarily a dream job. It was a choice, one that came with real consequences, one that, frankly, most modern people would not survive. And yet, that right, to pick up a weapon, to protect your home, to avenge your family, was something many Celtic women took seriously. In a world where survival depended on more than beauty, strength mattered, willpower mattered, and courage, that mattered most of all. If you, today, found yourself in that world, with its chill winds and its clashing swords, you might find it difficult to keep up. The wool would itch, the food would be bland, and your enemies wouldn't care what your skincare routine was. You would be cold, tired, scared. So no, Celtic women were not just housewives. They were warriors, leaders, and sometimes legends. But if you think you'd like to trade places with them, you might want to sleep on it first. In most stories about ancient societies, marriage is something permanent. A sacred duty. A bond never to be broken. Unless, of course, you're a Celtic woman. Then things were a little more negotiable. Celtic marriage wasn't exactly about fairy tale love. It was, more often, an agreement. A contract. Sometimes romantic. Sometimes strategic. But always practical. And if the contract no longer worked, well, there were options. You see, Celtic women, unlike many of their ancient counterparts, had the legal right to initiate divorce. Yes, really. They didn't need to be widowed, abandoned, or falsely accused of sorcery. If they wanted out, they could walk away, under specific conditions, of course. The Irish Brehon laws, some of the most detailed surviving legal codes from Celtic culture, outline up to 9 types of marriage, each with its own rules for rights, responsibilities, and, yes, exit strategies. Some unions were based on mutual contribution, some on love, some on money, and others, well, others were closer to temporary arrangements. One form of marriage allowed couples to live together on a kind of trial basis for a year. At the end of that year, if either party wasn't pleased, perhaps the cow herding wasn't up to standard, or someone snored too loudly, they could part ways. No shame, no public scandal, just an agreed-upon end, very modern, in its way. In more formal marriages, the reasons for divorce were spelled out clearly. A wife could leave her husband if he was impotent, abusive, or failed in his household duties. She could also leave if he gossiped too much about her. Yes, gossiping was a valid cause for separation, and not returning her cows. That too. Meanwhile, husbands could seek divorce if their wives were unfaithful, lazy with household tasks, or, oddly specific, if she inflicted blemishes on him. This might include physical injuries, or possibly emotional damage delivered through a very sharp tongue. Celtic women, as records suggest, were not always gentle with words. Property was also part of the arrangement. In many cases, if a woman brought wealth into the marriage, land, livestock, or labor, she could take it back when the marriage ended. The law aimed for balance. Not always perfect, but it tried. In fact, the detailed tracking of what each person contributed to the marriage could resemble a medieval spreadsheet, minus the Excel. And while this might sound progressive, divorce still had its social complexities. A woman who divorced might need to return to her family of origin. Her reputation might vary depending on local customs and religious influence. Still, the fact that she could divorce, on her own terms, is remarkable for its time. Now, if you were to imagine yourself living in that world, you might think it sounds liberating, but the reality would have been more complicated. For starters, there was no quiet court office or online filing system. Divorce was often handled through tribal negotiations. Elders might need to be present. Family members would weigh in. And depending on the type of marriage, there could be debates over cattle, grain, and who got to keep which cloak. Also, emotions weren't always the deciding factor. Love might not be the primary reason for marrying or separating. It was about function, about survival, and about managing alliances between families. So, if you walked away from a marriage, it might affect more than just your living arrangements. It could ripple into your clan, your tribe, and your economic future. But for all that, the Celtic attitude toward marriage and divorce was refreshingly flexible, not free of judgment, not always fair, but flexible. Especially when compared to the Roman world, where divorce was possible but heavily slanted in favor of men, or to early Christian societies, where marriage was increasingly considered sacred and binding. Celtic women were, in this sense, living in a legal grey space. They had options, they had conditions, and they had a voice. Of course, you might not have lasted long in that system yourself. You'd be trying to memorize 9 marriage types, each with subcategories. You'd need to negotiate dowries, land shares, milking schedules, and inheritance clauses. If you accidentally married under the wrong classification, it could affect your rights forever. Romantic, isn't it? So, yes, Celtic divorce laws were advanced. They allowed women to leave, to keep their property, to choose again. But that freedom came with complexity and with rules. Lots of rules. Which means, if you were hoping for a quick breakup and a fresh start, you might be in for a surprise, especially if there were sheep involved. In the end, Celtic love wasn't always soft, but it was structured, it was practical, and, perhaps most importantly, it was optional. We often imagine ancient marriages as matters of the heart, soulmates gazing across a misty forest, joining hands under the full moon. But in the Celtic world, romance was optional. Contracts, however, were not. Marriage among the Celts was less about fate and more about function. It was a partnership, a negotiation, a structured agreement that could involve land, livestock, and occasionally love, though love was not required. What mattered was clarity. Who owns what? Who owes what? And, most importantly, who gets the cows if things fall apart? The Celtic legal system, especially in Ireland under the Brehon laws, offered a surprisingly detailed framework for marriage. There wasn't just one way to marry. There were many. At least 9. In fact, each with its own set of rules. Some were based on mutual property ownership. Others allowed for unequal contribution. Some were temporary. Some permanent. Some were even unofficial, more like long-term cohabitation with paperwork on the side. The most interesting of these might be the trial marriage, a 1-year arrangement where 2 people could live together and decide if it worked. At the end of the year, either person could walk away, no harm done, provided the cows were returned and no new children had complicated the exit. It was a sort of Iron Age version of, let's see where this goes. If both parties were satisfied after a year, they could make things more formal. If not, they could separate, divide the assets, and move on. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense, but it was realistic, predictable, and, for the time, surprisingly modern. Marriages could also be formed for political or economic reasons. A union might bind two clans together, secure access to grazing land, or settle a long-standing feud. And while some arrangements were clearly unequal, such as when a powerful man took a woman of lower status, there were still expectations of fairness. The woman had to be provided for, she had to be respected. If the husband failed in these duties, she could leave, and she might even take the better portion of the property. One of the more curious details in these contracts involved how property was divided based on who contributed more. If a wife brought more wealth into the marriage than the husband, her voice carried more legal weight. If he brought more, he might have more control. But either way, the arrangement was defined. It was not assumed. It was not vague. It was recorded, probably not in ink, but certainly in memory and oral tradition. There were also rules about behavior. For example, if a husband embarrassed his wife publicly, perhaps by insulting her lineage or neglecting her in front of guests, that could be grounds for legal complaint. And vice versa. Marital dignity, it seems, mattered as much as shared assets. If you're imagining yourself in such a world, trying to navigate this web of rules, you might find it overwhelming. There were no online forms, no government marriage licenses. Everything depended on verbal agreements, clan witnesses, and careful memory. One wrong word could change the meaning of the arrangement. And if you didn't know the law, you might find yourself accidentally married or accidentally divorced. And then there's the matter of virginity, or rather, the lack of interest in it. Unlike many later societies that placed enormous weight on a woman's purity, the Celtic world was refreshingly indifferent. A woman's worth was not measured by her past, but by her present contribution, her wisdom, her labor, her ability to manage property or advise her clan. This attitude, unsurprisingly, offended the Romans, who viewed Celtic women as shockingly bold, both in action and in opinion. Even the appearance of Celtic weddings reflected this pragmatic spirit. There were ceremonies, yes, but they were often simple. A gathering, a statement of intent, a witnessed agreement, maybe some drinking, maybe a feast, but no grand spectacle, no 20-tiered cake, no swans. Just two people and their respective livestock, forming a legal bond. And if that bond didn't work out, as we've seen, divorce was possible. You could end the contract, you could renegotiate, you could, in theory, marry again, not for fate, but for function. So, while marriage in the Celtic world may not have involved soulmates or serendipity, it did involve agency, it involved law, it involved structure. And in its quiet way, it offered something rare in history, flexibility. But if you, a modern person, were transported into this system, it might feel less like a romance and more like signing a mortgage, with cows and spoken clauses, and the very real risk of having your in-laws recite your obligations at dinner. So yes, marriage was possible, but like many things in Celtic life, it was something you had to earn, maintain, and if needed, unmake, not with magic, but with mutual consent. When we think of medieval landowners, the image that comes to mind is usually male, an aging lord with a beard, perhaps sitting on a wooden chair, giving orders over who can graze where. But in the Celtic world, land ownership wasn't always a man's game. In fact, some of the most powerful people in Celtic communities were women, and not just in name. They owned land, they managed it, and sometimes they even auctioned it off. Under Celtic law, particularly in early Ireland, property rights were often passed through families, but not strictly through the male line. Daughters could inherit land, especially if there were no sons, or even in addition to them. And once they had it, they could use it. They could lease it, divide it, gift it, or sell it. They weren't simply caretakers, they were legal proprietors. Some women acquired land through dowries, others through inheritance, and still others through sheer business sense. Widows, especially, held a unique position. A widow could keep her late husband's estate, manage its operations, and even enter contracts with tenants. In some cases, she could remarry, or not, and continue to live independently with full control over her property. This independence extended to trade. Some Celtic women were landowners and merchants. They participated in markets, negotiated deals, and on occasion ran public auctions. Auctions in the Celtic world weren't quite like the high-speed gavel-thumping of today, but they served a similar purpose. Goods, animals, and land rights could all change hands in front of community witnesses. And if you happened to be a woman who knew her values and her value, you could thrive in such settings. Women of high rank were known to sponsor community feasts, religious festivals, and even building projects. This wasn't just generosity, it was influence. It showed who had resources and who knew how to use them. A wealthy Celtic woman might fund the repair of a sacred site or host a seasonal gathering for her village, not unlike a modern-day philanthropist, just with more cows and fewer press releases. Of course, with this ownership came responsibility. You had to defend your land, legally and sometimes physically. Boundaries weren't always respected. Disputes could arise over grazing rights, stone fences, or the use of a single well. And while formal lawsuits existed, there were times when disagreements were settled in less official ways. Words, feasts, or occasionally, sticks. Still, being a landowning woman didn't make you immune to the pressures of society. Jealousy, political shifts, and the ever-looming weight of invading forces could all change your status overnight. But while it lasted, the power was real, tangible, measured in acres and livestock. If you, a modern person, were dropped into such a world, you might be handed a small farmstead to manage. Sounds charming, at first, until you realize that every decision, from how many sheep to loan your cousin, to which path the cattle should take, could lead to an argument. There's no customer service hotline, just neighbors with long memories and sharp opinions. And yet, within all this, Celtic women managed. They kept records in memory. They made oral contracts. They bargained. They stood in circles of men and stated their rights clearly, calmly, and without blinking. So yes, Celtic women didn't just own land. They used it, grew from it, negotiated over it. And occasionally, when the deal was good and the timing right, they sold it, loudly, publicly, and entirely on their own terms. When we hear the word druid, most people imagine an old man with a long white beard, standing in a misty forest, whispering to the trees. But in the Celtic world, not all druids were men, and not all wisdom came with a beard. Women could be druids too. They could be keepers of ritual, tellers of prophecy, healers of wounds, and watchers of omens. They didn't just stir herbs in steaming bowls. They advised kings, they spoke with spirits, and they stood at the edges of battles, watching everything. Celtic society saw the world as layered, seen and unseen, living and dead, physical and spiritual. Druids were the ones who moved between these layers. They remembered the laws, the myths, the sacred patterns of time. And while the most well-known druids in Roman records were men, Celtic oral tradition includes women too, women who were feared, respected, and occasionally avoided. Some were bandrui, female druids who served as spiritual advisors. Others were bean fisa, or wise women, healers who used herbs, chants, and rituals to treat illness. Their work was part medicine, part magic. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But either way, people believed. And in a world without antibiotics or hospitals, belief often mattered as much as treatment. Healing, in this context, was more than physical. If your cattle died suddenly or your crops failed, you might not call a farmer. You might call a woman who knew which plants to burn, which incantations to whisper, and which spirits to appease. You might be given a charm to wear, or told to sleep with salt under your pillow, or bury an egg near the threshold of your home. The instructions might sound strange, but you'd follow them, because not doing so felt riskier. These women also acted as midwives, guiding births in cold huts, with nothing but clean cloth, warm water, and instinct. They knew which herbs could dull pain, and which could end it entirely. They were trusted, but also feared. Because knowledge, especially knowledge that men didn't control, made people nervous. Some of them told the future. Fortune-telling wasn't a carnival trick. It was a deeply spiritual act, reading signs in the wind, watching how birds flew, listening to dreams, or simply sitting beside a fire and saying what came into their minds. The gift of sight, they said, was not learned, it was given. If you were a chieftain preparing for war, you might ask a seer whether to wait or attack. If you were trying to conceive a child, you might ask when the stars were favorable. If you lost someone, you might ask whether their spirit was at peace. The answers weren't always clear, but they mattered. And yes, there were stories of women who predicted death, of visions that came true, of warnings that were ignored. The Celts believed that time wasn't a straight line. It was a circle, always turning, and those who could see even a few steps ahead were valuable, or dangerous, sometimes both. Now, if you imagine yourself in that world, sick, anxious, or afraid, you might find comfort in a woman who could brew you a tea of moss and mint, wrap you in warm cloth, and speak to you softly while the wind howled outside. Or you might feel uneasy because her eyes saw things yours didn't, because she spoke in metaphors, because she asked questions you weren't ready to answer. To modern ears, this kind of healing sounds odd, unscientific, superstitious. But to the Celtic people, it was part of the fabric of life. The body and the spirit were not separate, and neither were men and women in the world of power. A woman with knowledge was not out of place. She was expected. Of course, not everyone admired these women. The Romans, once again, found them disturbing. Powerful women who spoke of omens and fate were quickly labeled as witches or threats. Later, Christian influence would cast their rituals as pagan and dangerous. Many traditions disappeared, or went underground, or became whispers passed from grandmother to granddaughter. But for a time, Celtic women held sacred roles. They spoke with kings and commoners. They healed wounds and hearts. They whispered spells to the wind and watched the stars in silence, and the people listened. So yes, they were more than wives, more than warriors. They were druids, healers, and fortune-tellers. And if you met one, even today, you might feel something you can't explain. Call it power, call it wisdom, or just call it knowing. For a while, things worked. Celtic women held land. They made contracts. They healed. They spoke freely. Some even led armies. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Their laws, their customs, their forests, their stories. And then Rome came. Not suddenly, not all at once. The Roman Empire expanded like a slow tide, first curious, then ambitious, then relentless. By the 1st century BCE, Roman generals were eyeing Celtic territories with a mixture of hunger and disapproval. There was land to take, resources to extract, and people to civilize. That last part, civilize, was Rome's polite way of saying, make everyone act like us. To the Romans, Celtic societies were wild, unordered, too colourful, too emotional, and most troubling of all, too equal. Especially when it came to women. Roman writers often expressed shock at how freely Celtic women spoke, moved, and made decisions. It didn't fit their model of a well-run society. In Roman law, women were legal minors for life. They could not vote. They could not hold public office. Their property passed to male guardians. Their marriages were contracts. They could not easily exit. Their voices, legally speaking, were background noise. So when Roman soldiers marched into Celtic lands, into Gaul, into Britain, into parts of Iberia, they brought more than weapons. They brought a cultural system where women were expected to be quiet, modest, passive, the very things Celtic women had never been. And slowly, things began to change. Local laws were replaced by Roman ones. Trial marriages faded. Female land ownership became rare. Spiritual roles once held by women, like healing or prophecy, were folded into either Roman religion or dismissed as superstition. Women who once spoke for their clans were now expected to speak only at home, and not too loudly. The change didn't happen overnight. In some areas, Celtic customs lingered for generations. In others, resistance was fierce. But over time, under Roman administration, the space women had once held, socially, legally, spiritually, began to shrink. Even names changed. Celtic queens and warrior women were recast in Roman stories as novelties, or worse, threats. Independent women became symbols of wildness, disorder, something to conquer. Take Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni. After Roman authorities publicly humiliated her and her daughters, she led one of the most devastating rebellions in Roman Britain. She burned Roman cities. She united tribes. She came close to driving the Romans out. But after her defeat, her story was repackaged, told by Roman historians as a tale of passion, excess, and inevitable failure. She wasn't a hero, she was a warning. Other women, once respected for wisdom or ritual, were now labeled as witches. The spiritual became suspicious, the independent became dangerous, and the female voice, once loud in the Celtic world, grew quieter under Roman rule. If you had been a Celtic woman during this time, the shift might have felt subtle at first. A Roman tax official telling you your marriage wasn't legally recognized, a priest frowning at your herbal remedies, a soldier asking why you were speaking in a council. Small moments, but over time they would add up, until your world, once familiar, began to feel like it belonged to someone else. And you couldn't do much about it. The empire was vast. Its systems were slow but heavy. Its laws were clear. You could keep your language, for now. Your dress, maybe. But your authority? Your rights? Those were slipping. To be clear, the Celts weren't utopians. Their world had its flaws. Their freedom wasn't perfect. But they had built something real. A society where women, in many forms, could participate, could lead, could decide. Rome didn't erase that immediately, but it redirected it, and eventually, it buried it. So if you're wondering why we remember so few powerful women from ancient Europe, why their stories are rare, scattered, or framed as exceptions, it's not because they didn't exist. It's because the empire that wrote most of the surviving history didn't value them. But they were there, before the roads, before the temples, before the Latin, speaking boldly, owning land, healing wounds, waging wars, and choosing their own names. Then Rome came, and they became stories, half remembered, half erased, whispered at the edge of the fire. Not everyone accepted silence. Not everyone faded into the background. When power shifted, when laws changed, voices were muted, and customs erased, some Celtic women fought back, sometimes with words, sometimes with fire. Resistance didn't always look like a sword. Sometimes it looked like a woman refusing to give up her land, or continuing to pass on healing knowledge in secret, or raising her daughter to remember old laws, even after the new ones said they were invalid. But sometimes resistance was loud, very loud. The most famous, of course, was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, a mother, a warrior, a rebel. When Roman officials flogged her and assaulted her daughters, they expected submission. They did not expect what came next. She raised an army, tens of thousands. She spoke to tribes who had once been rivals and convinced them to unite. She led her people not just to battle, but to vengeance. Roman cities were burned, colonists fled, temples were torn down. She showed the empire that the spirit of Celtic resistance wasn't dead, it was just waiting. Her uprising ultimately failed. The Romans were better armed, better trained, and backed by a system too large to topple. But her legacy endured. Even her enemies remembered her name. And Boudica wasn't alone. Other stories, quieter, less recorded, tell of women who refused to vanish. In small villages, they preserved rituals. In families, they kept oral histories alive. Some posed as midwives but acted as spiritual advisors. Others passed down songs that spoke of earlier times, when land could belong to a daughter, and a woman's voice could shape a clan. To the Romans, these acts may have seemed small, but to the women living them, they were acts of defiance. Imagine this: you're a healer, trained by your grandmother. You've learned which roots ease pain, which flowers reduce fever. But now, under Roman rule, your work is called dangerous. You're told to stop. You don't argue. You don't fight. But you keep healing, quietly. You keep remembering. You keep teaching. That's resistance. Or picture a woman who once owned her home outright. After new laws, the land is transferred to her husband's family. She's now a guest in the house she grew up in. So she tells her daughter, "This was ours. Remember that." No court will record it, but her words do. The daughter remembers. That, too, is resistance. There were also women who joined bands of raiders, rebels hiding in the forests. stealing back supplies, harassing Roman outposts, making trouble when they could. History doesn't preserve their names, but it hints at them, in fragments, in whispers, in fear from the other side. These weren't organized movements. There were no manifestos, just individuals trying to keep what mattered from disappearing. And in the face of a machine like Rome, that mattered. It's easy to imagine that once an empire arrives, all is lost. But cultures don't vanish overnight. People hold on, sometimes in bold ways, sometimes quietly. They keep cooking old recipes. They carve forbidden symbols into wood. They speak ancient words to newborns in the dark. For Celtic women, resistance wasn't just about power. It was about dignity, about memory, about refusing to forget who they had been, even if the world no longer made space for it. You might think you would have resisted too, but it's hard to say. It meant risk, shame, isolation, sometimes worse. It meant knowing that the systems around you no longer served you, and acting anyway. And even if your acts were small, saying the wrong name for a holiday, planting herbs no one used anymore, telling your granddaughter about the trial marriage your great-grandmother once had, they mattered. Because every memory preserved was a seed. And some of those seeds, though buried by time, eventually grew back. So yes, some gave in, some stayed quiet, but others didn't. They fought back, in battles, in stories, in silence. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. In the end, what survives of a people is often not their voices, but the stories told about them. And for Celtic women, those stories were written by others, mostly men, mostly Roman, mostly uninterested in accuracy. So, what remains of these women, landowners, warriors, druids, healers, rebels, is not their real names, but shadows, descriptions from outside, fragments passed down, misunderstood, misquoted, or quietly erased. After the Roman conquest, the official records were written in Latin. Tribal histories were pushed aside, their oral traditions dismissed as superstition. Female leaders were called unruly, healers were called witches, wise women became warnings, and resistance was rewritten as madness. Even the very word Celtic is a Roman invention, a label given from the outside. The people who lived across Gaul, Ireland, Britain, and Iberia had many names for themselves. They spoke different dialects, worshipped different gods. But Roman writers preferred simplification. They preferred to group them, control them, flatten them. And so, the women of those tribes were flattened, too. A warrior queen became a tragic figure. A druidess became a curious myth. A landowner disappeared completely. Over time, the complexity faded. What was left were caricatures. Wild-haired barbarians in torn cloaks, screaming across muddy battlefields, or strange old women, muttering in the woods. None of them smiling, none of them wise, none of them whole. This wasn't always intentional. Sometimes it was simply the nature of empire. The conqueror writes the records. The defeated get footnotes, if that, but other times it was deliberate. A woman with power was inconvenient. She disrupted the clean lines of patriarchal history. So she was softened, or sharpened, or left out entirely. Even Boudica, one of the most documented Celtic women, was never truly written for her own sake. Roman historians portrayed her as both dangerous and emotional. Her strength made her monstrous. Her grief made her unstable. Her voice, though loud, was never hers. And for the thousands of women like her, who never led armies, but still held wisdom, dignity, and authority, there is silence. No books, no statues, no inscriptions. Just bones buried under fields, and stories that never made it onto scrolls. Imagine living your whole life tending land, raising children, healing neighbors, advising your clan. Imagine doing all of this in a time when the world was uncertain and the laws kept changing. And then imagine that, 1,000 years later, the only word left to describe you is barbarian. It happens more than you'd think. History isn't always what happened, it's what someone wrote down. And when the recorders are conquerors, priests, or politicians, the version we inherit is carefully shaped, cleaned, edited. This is not unique to Celtic women, but their story is a clear example. A civilization with rich traditions, layered roles, and strong female figures, now remembered mostly through second-hand accounts, or not at all. And yet, they are not entirely lost. In recent decades, scholars have begun to look again, to read between the lines, to trace old laws, old myths, old symbols, to hear the voices that were once drowned out. What emerges is not a single image, but a mosaic. A woman planting herbs behind her home, a mother teaching her daughter how to settle a dispute, a healer whispering to the forest before mixing a tincture, a leader speaking at a tribal gathering, a rebel hiding in the trees. They may not have left written words, but they left patterns, echoes, questions that tug at the edges of the historical record. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to know all their names to honor their presence. Maybe it's enough to know they lived fully, fiercely, and freely until they were told not to. And even then, some didn't listen. So yes, history got the name wrong. It got the roles wrong. Sometimes the language, sometimes the tone. But now, we can listen differently. We can read slower. We can ask what's missing. And we can remember, softly, that sometimes the truest stories are the ones never written at all. For a brief stretch of history, tucked between myth and empire, Celtic women lived lives more free than most of us might imagine. They owned land. They made laws. They healed, fought, divorced, prophesied, and governed. They lived in a world that, while harsh and unpredictable, offered them voices that could be heard. And then, much of it faded. Not all at once, but slowly. As the Romans arrived with their systems and silence, as Christianity reshaped laws and expectations, as written history leaned more toward conquerors than communities, these women, and what they represented, were left behind. Not because they didn't exist, but because their existence didn't fit the story others wanted to tell. Today, we know them only in glimpses, in old laws, in footnotes, in Roman complaints about unruly wives. But behind those fragments is something clear. They were not invisible. They were erased. So what remains? A quiet sense of continuity. A reminder that power once looked different, that freedom once had a softer shape, woven into contracts, passed through herbs, carried in battle cries and bedtime stories. You wouldn't last a day in their world, the cold, the dirt, the weight of it all. But they did, and maybe, in knowing that, we don't just remember them. We learn to look differently at our own stories too. In the world before showers, deodorants, and daily hygiene routines, everyone had a smell. And that wasn't considered a problem. In fact, it was just life. For most of human history, the concept of smelling nice wasn't a universal expectation. It wasn't even really an expectation at all. Scent was natural. It came from your body, your clothes, your work, your food, your environment, and nobody thought too hard about it. People weren't walking around thinking, I smell bad, because everyone smelled the same way. Human, earthy, sweaty, sometimes sour, maybe a little smoky if you'd been near a fire, or sweet if you worked near herbs or incense. But personal odor wasn't labeled good or bad, it just was. Soap existed, yes, but not the kind you're thinking of. Early soaps were often made from animal fat and ashes. They weren't used every day, or even every week. Sometimes, they weren't even used on the body. They were saved for washing clothes, tools, or ritual purposes. Body cleaning? That was rare. In most ancient societies, water wasn't always easy to access. Bathing meant effort. Heating water took time. Finding privacy was difficult. And if you were working long hours in a field or a forge, scrubbing your armpits wasn't a top priority. The day ended when the sun went down, and the best you could do might be wiping your face with a cloth. Besides, people lived in a world full of other strong smells. Open sewers, livestock, wood smoke, unwashed wool, cooked onions, leather, fish. The human body wasn't standing out against that background. It was just another scent in the mix. And here's something that might surprise you. Smell was often linked to identity. Families, towns, even professions carried distinct scents. A tanner smelled different from a baker. A farmer different from a nobleman. These smells were familiar, comforting, even belonging. A mother could recognize her child in a crowd by scent. A shepherd could smell his flock. In some communities, washing off your natural smell might even be seen as strange or suspicious. Too much effort to be clean meant you were either trying to impress someone or hiding something. So no one wore deodorant. No one spritzed perfume after the gym, and absolutely no one was taking cold eucalyptus showers at 6 a.m. They didn't need to. Because smelling human wasn't a flaw. It wasn't shameful. It didn't mean you were lazy or unrefined. It meant you were alive. You worked. You ate. You moved through a world without filters. It's worth remembering. Cleanliness was often a privilege, something tied to wealth, location, and culture. For most, survival came first. Soap came second, if it came at all. So if you're lying in bed right now, fresh from a hot shower, under clean sheets with scented detergent, know this. You're experiencing a luxury that would have seemed utterly unnecessary, or even strange, to most of our ancestors. And they probably wouldn't have minded your smell either. Unless, of course, you smelled too clean. If you traveled back to medieval Europe and told people you bathed every day, they'd probably look at you with concern. Not admiration, concern. In the Middle Ages, personal hygiene didn't mean being spotless. In fact, being too clean could get you noticed for all the wrong reasons. Bathing wasn't just rare. It was, in many places and times, considered risky, indulgent, or even morally questionable. There were practical concerns, of course. Medieval doctors believed that opening the pores with hot water allowed disease to enter the body. A warm bath didn't feel relaxing. It felt dangerous. The idea was that your skin needed to stay sealed and protected. Washing too often weakened your body's defenses. As strange as that sounds now, it made sense in a world where germs hadn't been discovered yet. Illness came from bad air, evil spirits, or bodily imbalances, not bacteria. So when someone got sick after a bath, the logic was simple. Bathing caused it. Clean skin, then, wasn't just suspicious, it was unnatural. And if you were too clean, people might wonder why. Were you hiding something? Trying to seduce someone? Or worse, were you a witch? In some regions and eras, the connection between water and witchcraft ran deep. Witches were often accused of using baths or special potions to change their appearance or gain powers. People who washed often, especially women, risked being seen as vain, seductive, or magically suspicious. Bathhouses did exist, and some cities had quite a few of them. But they weren't exactly spa retreats. They were often social centers, places to talk, eat, gossip, and sometimes more. In time, bathhouses gained a reputation not just for washing, but for immoral behavior, so even going to one too often could damage your reputation. Eventually, many bathhouses were shut down altogether, some for health concerns, others for moral ones. In cities struck by plague, officials believed that baths weakened the body and made people vulnerable to the disease. In a time of fear and superstition, cleanliness became a liability. Instead of bathing, people turned to alternatives. They wiped down with cloths, changed undergarments when possible, added layers of perfume, herbs, or scented powders to mask odors. But full immersion in water? That was reserved for very special occasions, weddings, births, or illness. In fact, some people believed that a bath should be prescribed like medicine. You didn't wash to feel good. You washed when your doctor told you to. And even then, it was done cautiously, with lukewarm water, and followed by plenty of drying and covering. Royalty weren't exempt from this thinking. Some kings and queens bathed only a few times a year, if that. And when they did, the entire process was ceremonial, surrounded by servants, herbs, and layers of linen. It was less about getting clean, and more about doing it right. The idea of showering every day would have seemed bizarre, wasteful, maybe even self-obsessed. Who had time for that, anyway? You had work, prayer, survival, and maybe the occasional war. A bath was a luxury, or a risk. So if you enjoy long hot showers or bubble baths with candles and music, congratulations. You're living in a very modern moment. Back then, water was suspicious, steam was dangerous, and being too clean was, well, socially risky. In a world that didn't trust water, Smelling natural was the safest thing you could do. If you lived in medieval Europe and didn't bathe often, which, as we've established, was most people, what could you do about body odor? Simple, you covered it up. Not with deodorant, not with soap, but with perfume. Lots of it, but don't imagine a delicate spritz on the wrist or a soft mist in the air. This wasn't about adding a little fragrance. It was about overpowering everything else. Perfume in the Middle Ages wasn't a luxury for the senses. It was a weapon against stench. The upper classes, in particular, became masters of olfactory camouflage. They soaked gloves in rose water. They tucked sachets of herbs into their sleeves. They held scented handkerchiefs to their noses while walking through crowded streets. Not for elegance, for survival. Sometimes, people didn't even wear perfume on their skin. They perfumed their clothes, coats, hats, undergarments, cloaks. If it touched the body, it got doused. They perfumed their furniture, their pets, their bed linens, their wigs. Everything became a kind of aromatic barrier between the person and the world. And while this might sound excessive, it wasn't just about smelling pleasant, it was about health. Remember the medieval theory of miasma, the belief that bad smells cause disease? If foul air could make you sick, then good smells could protect you. Perfume, in this worldview, wasn't just fashionable, it was functional, like an invisible shield. So people carried pomanders, small balls of scented materials hung around the neck or attached to belts. Physicians wore long beak-like masks, stuffed with herbs and flowers when visiting plague victims. Perfume was more than scent, it was armor. The irony, of course, is that the people most covered in perfume were often the ones least likely to bathe: royals, nobles, clergy. The richer you were, the more perfume you used, and the more layers of unwashed clothing you wore beneath it. Take gloves, for example. Upper-class gloves were often perfumed inside and out, then worn for weeks. You didn't remove them, you didn't clean them. They simply absorbed more and more of you. Perfume didn't erase the smell, it layered it. This created what some might politely call complex scent profiles. A nobleman might smell like lavender, leather, tobacco, and last Tuesday's dinner. A lady might carry notes of rosewater, cinnamon, candle smoke, and a hint of mold. But it was status. Smelling like imported musk or exotic resins said, "I can afford things you've never heard of." The scent of luxury wasn't necessarily pleasant. It was rare, powerful, recognizable. And yet, for all this effort, nobody truly expected to smell good. That concept didn't quite exist yet. You weren't trying to attract noses, you were trying to repel judgment. Or at least mask your humanity enough to blend in at court. So next time you spray perfume after a shower, remember, you're doing it backwards. They used perfume instead of washing. It was their soap, their sanitizer, their deodorant, and occasionally their only defense against themselves. Because in the medieval world, being clean was questionable. But smelling powerful? That was perfectly acceptable. Not everyone in the medieval world had perfumed gloves or scented cloaks. In fact, most people didn't even own a second shirt. For the average medieval worker, farmers, blacksmiths, shepherds, millers, smell wasn't something to worry about. It was something you lived in, a constant companion. As ordinary as your boots or your tools. These were people who worked from sunrise to sunset, mostly outdoors, mostly with their hands, and almost always surrounded by natural elements that clung to everything. Mud, smoke, hay, sweat, livestock. Your body didn't just smell after work, it was shaped by the work itself. A farmer, for example, spent their days walking behind animals, digging into wet soil, harvesting grain under the sun. That meant dust, damp wool, manure, leather straps, and open wounds, all mixing into one daily scent. A blacksmith? Picture hot metal, smoke, oil, and scorched fabric. Then imagine wearing the same tunic for weeks, without washing it, or yourself, and without a proper chimney to carry the smoke away. That scent didn't wash out. It became part of you. Even something as gentle-sounding as shepherding wasn't so clean. Sheep aren't tidy, neither are mountain paths, rain-soaked hills, or wool shearing. Most shepherds also had to sleep near their animals, wrapped in the same cloak they wore all day. Bathing, for the laboring class, wasn't just rare, it was impractical. You didn't have time. You didn't have fuel to heat water. You might not have had a private space, and even if you did, you probably thought it wasn't worth the risk. Instead, people wiped down with cloths or rinsed their feet in streams. They might clean visible parts, hands, face, but the rest was left alone. And their clothes? Those were only washed when absolutely necessary, because scrubbing cloth on a washboard was labor too. There was no shame in this. Everyone around you lived the same way. You smelled like sweat and soil because you worked, and that meant you were useful. In some ways, smell was a badge of honesty. You earned your odor. It told others you had put in the hours, that you'd harvested grain or hammered tools or tended animals. A person who smelled like lavender? Suspicious, probably didn't work at all. And even beyond personal odor, the medieval village itself had a smell. A collective one. Wood smoke from hearths, mud after rain, pickled vegetables, bread rising, livestock nearby, wet leather, damp wool, fish. All of it layered into a kind of local perfume, distinct, familiar, and entirely unbottled. Of course, this doesn't mean life was pleasant. In summer, the heat amplified everything. In winter, the cold trapped smoke indoors. Ventilation was a luxury. Soap was scarce. You lived in your labor, and so did your nose. But people didn't recoil from it. They didn't light candles or open windows or complain, because this was life. This was the smell of making things, growing food, feeding families. This was the scent of survival. Today, we associate strong body odor with embarrassment, something to be avoided, hidden, erased. But in the medieval world, it was background noise, like birdsong or barking dogs. It told a story, not a shameful one, just a very human one. So if you've ever come home from work and thought, I need a shower, just know your medieval ancestors would have nodded in approval, and then probably kept chopping wood. In the modern world, bathing is routine. So routine, in fact, that we schedule it between emails and errands. But in the medieval world, bathing was an event, a rare one, and sometimes a frightening one. It wasn't that people didn't clean themselves at all. They did, sort of. They washed their hands and faces with cold water. They wiped sweat with cloth. They shook out dusty garments and rinsed their feet. But a full-body soak? That was something else entirely. To bathe properly meant time, effort, and resources. First, you needed a tub, often made of wood. Then you needed to heat water, usually by hauling it in buckets and warming it over fire. You needed space, privacy, help, sometimes. You also needed to believe the bath was worth the risk. And yes, risk. Because for many, bathing wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. As mentioned earlier, medieval medical theories warned that hot water opened the body's pores. That made you vulnerable. Disease, bad air, even evil spirits could sneak in while you were squeaky clean. The logic was simple. If someone bathed and got sick after, the bath was to blame. In some places, this belief turned into a full-blown fear. Bathing too often might weaken your spirit, or cause melancholy, or disturb the balance of your humours, and once your humours were off, anything could happen. Fevers, madness, death. So baths were reserved for rare occasions. Big moments, weddings, births, major illnesses, funerals. In some cases, if you didn't make it, people might also bathe before religious ceremonies, or if instructed to do so by a physician. But even then, it was cautious. And this wasn't a solo spa experience. In wealthier households, bathers were often assisted by servants. Buckets would be filled, herbs added, towels warmed. But it was a serious affair, not a casual rinse. In poorer homes, the whole family might share a bath, one at a time, using the same water, starting with the eldest or the cleanest. By the time the youngest child entered the tub, it was mostly lukewarm soup. This is, incidentally, where the phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," may have originated. Public bathhouses did exist in cities across Europe, particularly in earlier centuries. They were places to wash, socialize, even dine. But by the late Middle Ages, many were shut down, accused of spreading disease or immoral behavior. In times of plague, people avoided them entirely. So most people didn't bathe, and when they did, It wasn't relaxing, it was uncertain. You came out cleaner, maybe, but you also came out exposed and colder, and possibly at risk of catching something from the very act of washing. Instead, people turned to what we might now call dry hygiene. They changed underclothes, used perfumes or herbs, and scraped dirt from their skin with dull knives or cloth. It worked well enough. Or at least, no one expected more. Today, we take hot showers for stress relief. We use lavender-scented soap and stand under rainfall showerheads in quiet bathrooms. But for most of medieval history, bathing was closer to a medical procedure or a spiritual event, rare, serious, and not without risk. So if you ever skip a shower and feel guilty, don't. Your medieval ancestors skipped them all the time. Not out of laziness, but out of caution. Because in their world, being clean was fine. But getting clean, that was the real danger. In the medieval world, you'd think royalty would be the cleanest people in the room. After all, they had access to the best of everything. Silks, spices, servants, stone bathtubs carved by hand. But ironically, the more powerful you were, the more likely you smelled. And not lightly. The myth of perfumed princes and lavender-scented queens is more Renaissance painting than reality. Most nobles weren't freshly washed. They were marinated, slowly, thoroughly, in layers of expensive clothing, thick fabrics, and time. Let's start with the clothes. Wealthy individuals didn't just wear more garments. They wore more layers of them. Undergarments, padded robes, tunics, cloaks, furs, corsets, sleeves, collars, gloves, hats, and many of these were never or rarely washed. Wool was hard to clean, silks could be damaged, fur, impossible. So instead, nobles simply aired their outfits and hoped for the best. Some kings reportedly changed their shirts once a month, others preferred to have their linens scented with herbs and simply reapplied over a less than fresh body. After all, bathing was rare, and changing clothes too often was considered a wasteful habit, especially if you had dozens of servants and nowhere urgent to be. Of course, nobility didn't go entirely scentless. They had perfumes, powders, and floral oils. But as we saw earlier, these were used on top of natural odors, not instead of them. The result was layered, not subtle, and definitely not always pleasant. In fact, smelling strong could be a status symbol. The average peasant couldn't afford cinnamon oil from the East, ambergris from Wales, or imported musk. So if you walked into a room trailing a cloud of exotic scent, mixed with wool and unwashed velvet, people knew one thing: you had money. The same went for food. Richer people ate richer things. Game meats, onions, garlic, heavy sauces. Their bodies reflected their diets, often through breath, sweat, and digestion, which was fine, because, again, no one expected nobles to smell clean, just powerful. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about separation. The body of a noble wasn't expected to behave like a peasant's. Nobles didn't do hard labor. They didn't dig in the dirt. Their smell was different because their lives were different, even if the difference came down to decaying fabric and spoiled ointments. And servants, well, their job often included enduring the scent, fanning it, powdering it, helping to redress it. In some cases, servants themselves were perfumed, so the air around their lords would smell acceptable, but the bodies underneath? That was another story. There are records of monarchs with legendary hygiene habits, or lack thereof. One French king was said to avoid water at all costs. Another was known to apply new perfume rather than change his clothes. One noblewoman was so heavily scented, guests couldn't stay near her for more than a few minutes. Yet no one dared complain. Smell was class, and class could not be questioned. So while peasants may have smelled of cows and cabbage, the noble class had their own unique fragrance: damp velvet, old herbs, and powdered wig glue, perhaps a hint of candle wax and ink, and a lot of history. Today, we link power to polish, shaved, sprayed, styled. But in the medieval world, power could be overwhelming in more sensory ways. So if you've ever worried about smelling a little off, remember, in the 14th century, that scent might have made you king. Today, When we think of luxury fragrances, we imagine something clean, soft, maybe floral or citrusy. Something that lingers gently in the air and makes people lean in, not back away. But in the medieval and early modern world, luxury didn't always smell nice. In fact, it didn't have to. The richest people of the time didn't wear perfume to be appealing. They wore it to make a statement, one that said, "I can afford to smell like something you've never even heard of." Exotic ingredients were key. Musk from the glands of a musk deer, civet oil from a cat-like animal's scent glands, ambergris, a waxy substance from a sperm whale's digestive system, all highly prized, all expensive, and all just a little off. These smells weren't clean or delicate. They were heavy, animalic, sometimes sharp or oily. To modern noses, they could be overwhelming or even unpleasant. But back then, that was part of their power, because true wealth didn't mean smelling like a field of lavender. It meant smelling like the far corners of the earth, like the Silk Road, the spice ships, the rare traders who carried strange goods in locked chests. A noble's scent was meant to say, "This cost a fortune," whether it pleased anyone or not. Perfume was also a performance, a full sensory layer of your identity. A noblewoman's gloves might be soaked in clove oil. A bishop's robes might carry the scent of frankincense and old ink. A merchant's home might smell like sandalwood, rotting oranges, and burning tallow. Smell didn't follow modern categories of good or bad. It followed meaning. A powerful scent was a boundary, a marker of class. You weren't supposed to smell like soap. That would have meant you worked with your hands. You weren't supposed to smell like fresh air. That would have meant you were outside. Instead, you wore your wealth in layers, silks, brocades, and scent. The more difficult the smell was to obtain, the more it proved your status. Even if people had to hold their breath around you. Some nobles reportedly kept bundles of herbs or cloth soaked in musk beneath their arms, not to reduce odor, but to amplify it. Their scent announced them long before they entered the room. And if it lingered for hours afterward, even better. Interestingly, these smells weren't just tolerated, they were often remembered fondly. Letters and poems describe the musk of royalty or the incense of nobility. People didn't complain, they aspired to those smells. Because in a world where scent was tied to class, discomfort didn't matter, only recognition did. So no, luxury didn't always smell good. But it smelled expensive. And that was more important. Unlike their medieval successors, the ancient Greeks weren't suspicious of water. They didn't fear soap, and they didn't think that washing made you weak or open to disease. In fact, for the Greeks, bathing was a lifestyle. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was cultural, social, and even philosophical. To be clean was to be civilized. To maintain your body was to honor it, and to neglect hygiene was, in some cases, seen as a sign of ignorance or moral failing. Bathing wasn't reserved for special occasions. It was part of the daily rhythm, before meals, after exercise, in preparation for religious rituals, or simply to feel refreshed. Greek homes often had small bathing spaces, with basins or tubs and simple drainage systems. But the real stars of ancient cleanliness were the public baths, especially in gymnasia. These were not luxurious spa retreats. They were functional, social, and, above all, shared. A typical Greek bathing routine included warm water, followed by scraping the body clean using a curved metal tool called a strigil. Soap wasn't always necessary. Instead, people applied olive oil to the skin, then scraped off the oil, sweat, and dust. This left the skin soft, supple, and free of the grime collected during wrestling, running, or simply existing. Afterward, they might rub in a fresh layer of oil, sometimes scented with herbs like thyme or myrtle. Not because they feared odor, but because it felt good, looked good, and showed care for the self. To the Greeks, the body was something to be admired, not hidden or feared. Statues, stories, and sports all celebrated the human form. Keeping it clean was not vanity, it was virtue. Even philosophers had opinions about bathing. Socrates bathed reluctantly, preferring to focus on the life of the mind. But his student, Plato, acknowledged the balance, writing that the health of the body supported the health of the soul. Bathing, then, wasn't frivolous. It was part of living well. A clean body helped you think better, speak better, and be better. The Greeks also linked cleanliness to hospitality. Visitors might be offered water to wash their hands or feet. Hosts prepared baths for guests. To welcome someone meant offering comfort. And that started with washing off the road. Bathhouses were not quiet retreats. They were places to talk, argue, joke, and plan. A man might discuss politics in the warm water, or get philosophical while rubbing olive oil into his arms. It wasn't strange. It was normal. Of course, bathing wasn't always private, and modesty standards differed from modern ones. But again, the body was not viewed with shame. It was practical, human, and worthy of care. So, if the medieval mindset saw bathing as dangerous, the Greek mindset saw it as necessary, not indulgent, just part of being alive and awake. And while they didn't have shampoo, eucalyptus steam, or scented candles, the ancient Greeks would have looked at our modern hygiene routines with approval. Because for them, bathing wasn't just about getting clean. It was about living right. If the Greeks turned bathing into a daily habit, the Romans took it even further. They made it an institution, a routine, a ritual, and, more importantly, a social event. In ancient Rome, bathing wasn't something you did alone in the quiet of your home. It was something you did in public, with everyone. The Roman thermae, or public bathhouses, were massive architectural complexes. Some could fit hundreds of people at once. And these weren't just tubs of warm water. They were organized experiences, complete with hot rooms, cold plunges, massage tables, and places to read, exercise, gossip, or conduct business. The bath was part of daily life for most Roman citizens. Rich or poor, young or old, everyone had access. Entry was cheap, and for many, it was the cleanest place they'd ever visit. But here's the interesting part. With all that water, all those oils, and all those shared scrapers and towels, there were a lot of smells. Roman bathhouses had a very specific scent profile. Imagine the steam from hot water mixing with sweat, olive oil, mildew, old towels, and conversations. Add in perfumes, heated stone, wet sandals, and the occasional dropped fig. The result wasn't unpleasant, but it was alive. Because the Roman bath wasn't just where you cleaned yourself, it was where you experienced other people's cleanliness. Or lack of it. You didn't just wash, you waited, you watched, you shared benches, strigils, and sponges. You might borrow someone's oil flask, or sit beside a man who hadn't washed in days, until now. The point wasn't isolation, it was collective hygiene, a shared ritual that said, we're all human, let's rinse off the day together. In fact, the Romans believed that communal bathing helped strengthen society. It encouraged good habits, kept bodies healthy, and created a space where citizens could meet outside of work or home. Senators might bathe near soldiers, merchants near poets. Cleanliness became a common ground. There was even bathhouse etiquette. People were expected to behave decently, share the space, and not splash too much. Although, of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some bathers were loud, some skipped the soap, some made too much eye contact. But despite the occasional awkwardness, bathhouses remained central to Roman life. Children learned to bathe there. Elders relaxed there. Philosophers debated while covered in steam. And when you left, you might not have been perfumed, but you were oiled, scraped, rinsed, and probably smelling a little bit like everyone else. Because that was the point. Roman bathing wasn't just personal. It was public identity maintenance. You washed yourself, and, in doing so, you participated in civilization. It's easy now to think of hygiene as private, but to a Roman, it was something shared, smell included. So the next time you're in a crowded gym locker room and wondering who forgot deodorant, remember, the Romans would have considered that completely normal. While Europe was struggling with soap, superstition, and sweaty royalty, ancient cultures in Asia were quietly developing their own relationship with scent, one that was less about covering odor and more about harmony. In traditional East Asian societies, particularly in China and Japan, smell wasn't seen as something to erase. It was seen as something to cultivate, a way to express refinement, presence, and even morality. But unlike the West, where perfume was applied directly to the body to mask odors, in many parts of Asia, scent was applied to the environment, to fabrics, to rooms, to air. You didn't wear the smell, you lived inside it. In China, nobles often incensed their clothing, using special carved boxes filled with fragrant wood or herbs. The garments would absorb the smoke, taking on a gentle aroma, nothing overwhelming, just a quiet suggestion of elegance. Incense played a large role in daily life, especially among scholars, monks, and the elite. It was burned during reading, writing, meditation, and even bathing, turning simple routines into rituals. The idea wasn't to fix the body's smell, it was to elevate the space around it. In Japan, this practice became an art form known as kodo, or the way of incense. Like tea ceremony or calligraphy, kodo was a structured, meditative tradition. Participants didn't just burn incense, they listened to it. They identified its origin, its texture, its emotional tone. It was scent as philosophy. And yes, hygiene mattered too. Japanese households emphasized cleanliness, and bathing became a regular, almost spiritual habit. Heated baths, known as ofuro, were used to cleanse not just the body, but the mind. Still, even with regular bathing, natural scent remained. Summer heat meant sweat. Layers of kimono or robes trapped body warmth, and strong deodorants didn't exist. But instead of fighting these realities, people accepted them. To combat unpleasant smells, people would tuck aromatic sachets into their sleeves or undergarments, filled with dried orange peel, sandalwood, or plum blossoms. In wealthier homes, garments were stored in scented wooden chests, so they would carry a subtle fragrance even before being worn. And perhaps most interestingly, smell was tied to behavior. A refined person didn't just smell pleasant, they moved gently, avoided harsh spices, and behaved with grace. Body and scent worked together. There was also a seasonal rhythm. Heavier incense in winter, lighter, floral tones in spring, and in summer, when no amount of scent could fight the humidity, people simply sweated and waited. In traditional Asia, fragrance wasn't about domination. It wasn't used to announce power, wealth, or status. It was used to balance the world around you. A breath of cedar, a trace of tea, a note of age and quiet. So while Western nobles were drowning in musk and medieval towns were holding their noses, Asia was busy listening to the quiet perfume of wood, earth, and time. Because sometimes, the most powerful scent is the one that doesn't shout. Long before ID cards, fingerprints, or facial recognition, there was another way to know who someone was. You didn't need to see them, you just needed to smell them. In a world without synthetic perfumes, deodorants, or industrial soap, people had a natural scent, a unique mix of sweat, skin, food, fabric, and habit. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't shameful. It was simply them. Everyone carried their own chemical identity, not just between classes or professions, but between individuals. And for those who lived close together, families, lovers, communities, it became part of daily life. Familiar, intimate, comforting. You could recognize someone by the smell of their clothes, their hair, the leather of their boots, or the herbs they cooked with. You knew when someone had just left a room. You could follow the scent trail of your child through a busy street. Lovers used scent as memory, a tunic left behind, a blanket still warm, a lock of hair in a box, faintly holding the smell of someone dear. In stories and poems, people didn't just miss the face or voice of someone, they missed their presence, which often meant their scent. And this was more than just sentiment. The brain remembers smell. Of all the senses, it's the most deeply tied to memory. One whiff of a familiar scent, and you're back in a childhood kitchen, a battlefield, a lover's arms. In a world without photographs or recordings, scent carried weight. Even animals noticed. Shepherds could distinguish their flock by scent. Dogs followed trails that no human could detect. And humans, too. responded to these cues without thinking. A village elder might carry the scent of old tobacco and wool. A priest might smell faintly of wax and incense. Body odor wasn't something to hide. It was something to know. There are even accounts of people using scent for protection. Mothers would keep an infant close by smell alone. Some cultures believed your scent stayed with you into the afterlife. Others used it in matchmaking, choosing a partner not just by appearance or wealth, but by compatibility of scent. Today, we might call that chemistry. Back then, it was just instinct. Of course, strong odors still had limits. If someone smelled too unfamiliar, too different, it could cause discomfort or even suspicion. But that discomfort came not from the smell itself, but from not recognizing it. In many ways, natural scent was proof of proximity. You didn't truly know someone until you knew how they smelled after a long day, after rain, after work. We've since scrubbed away most of that world. Our clothes are washed in scented detergent. Our bodies are coated in soaps, sprays, and shampoos. Every trace of individuality erased and replaced with product. But somewhere, deep in memory, the idea remains that each of us carries a quiet, invisible fingerprint, a scent that says, "You're home." If history had a smell, it wouldn't be roses. It wouldn't be fresh linen or lemon-scented floors. It would be something heavier, earthier, something that lingered in wool coats and stone walls. The past smelled like bodies. Living, breathing, sweating bodies, layered in cloth, dust, oil, and time. It smelled like firewood and boiled cabbage, like wet leather and soot, like sheep pens, old books, and the inside of a wooden chest. It wasn't a single smell. It was a collage. Each place, each class, each task had its own scent story. The palace smelled different from the bakery, the monastery different from the battlefield. The nobleman and the blacksmith walked through the same air, but left different trails. And yes, some of it would offend modern noses. Chamber pots were real. So were unwashed cloaks, streets with no drains, and people who had never owned a second pair of shoes. Sanitation was inconsistent. Ventilation was rare. Illness left its mark, and so did death. But the scent of the past was also deeply human. You knew when bread had just been pulled from an oven. You could tell what your neighbor was cooking by the smell drifting from their window. Markets smelled of dried herbs, ripe fruit, open fish, and hot wine. Armies smelled of iron, blood, and mud. These weren't artificial smells. They weren't chosen. They just happened. And for people living then, they weren't unpleasant. They were normal. You didn't recoil at the odor of horses because horses were everywhere. You didn't judge the smell of your friend's tunic because yours probably wasn't much better. What mattered wasn't pleasant or fresh. It was familiarity. Smell helped locate you in the world, in a family, a village, a profession. And when people remembered the past, they remembered its scent. A specific soap your grandmother used, the smoke from a certain kind of wood, the musty warmth of books in a monastery, smells that could bring you back, not to facts, but to feelings. Because scent is honest. It doesn't lie like a painting. It doesn't smooth over details like memory. It lingers, difficult to describe, but impossible to forget. That's why old places still hold something powerful. A whisper in the air. A trace of oil in the floorboards. A dry, dusty smell in the curtains. The past never fully leaves. It just softens. Today, we live in a world of controlled air. Filtered, perfumed, sanitized. But history was messier, rougher, riper, and in many ways, more real. So if you could visit the past, not in a book or a museum, but physically, with your eyes, hands, and especially your nose, you might find it overwhelming. But you'd also find something raw, something vivid, not always pleasant, but unforgettable. Because while history speaks in dates and names, it also lingers in smell, and sometimes it's the scent that brings it all back. We often imagine the past in images, castles, robes, candles, swords. We picture stone streets, great halls, dusty scrolls, but history wasn't silent, and it definitely wasn't scentless. The people who lived before us didn't just build civilizations, they carried them in layers of wool, in smoke-stained cloaks, in the quiet trace of oil on skin. Their world was defined as much by odor as it was by architecture or art. They lived without soap as we know it, without deodorants, without scented detergent. And yet, they managed, because they understood smell differently. It was social, spiritual, practical. A signal of class. A ritual. A warning. A memory. Sometimes, the richest people smelled the most. Sometimes, the cleanest were seen as suspicious. Sometimes, a lover's presence lingered in nothing more than a scarf that smelled like them. Cultures across the world responded in their own ways. Europe masked odor with perfume. Asia infused rooms and clothing with incense. Rome bathed together in public harmony. Medieval peasants wore the seasons on their skin. To us, it might all seem unhygienic, strange, even unpleasant. But to them, it was normal, it was truth. And perhaps that's the lesson. Scent is the part of history we rarely talk about, but it's always been there, under every robe, inside every room, at the center of every ritual. It marked identity, it shaped desire, it warned of danger. And it lingered longer than most records. Today, we filter it all out. We sterilize, sanitize, deodorize. But when we do, we may also lose a kind of closeness to others and to the past. So maybe, just for a moment, you can imagine the world not as a painting or a textbook, but as a room you've just walked into, dimly lit, warm, soft with sound, and carrying a scent you can't quite name. Something ancient, something human, something real. That's history too.